The bus stop was empty until the car circled back for the second time. That's when I realized the man sitting beside me wasn't waiting for a bus. 2 years ago, on Thanksgiving night, I made the worst decision of my life. I should have stayed in my dorm, locked the door, and slept off the virus that was tearing through my body. Instead, sick, feverish, barely able to breathe without coughing, I dragged myself across the city carrying a bowling ball, tennis rackets, and a bag of Thanksgiving leftovers because I was too stubborn to break a promise. At the time, I was 19 years old, small, exhausted, and completely alone. A friend from work had asked me to watch her elderly cat while she was out of town. The cat needed medication every day, and I had promised weeks earlier before getting sick. Even after the fever hit, even after my body started shaking from chills so hard I could barely stand, I still convinced myself I could handle it. Earlier that day, I'd also gone to my father's place to pick up my old tennis rackets and bowling ball. A friend and I had been talking for weeks about playing again like we used to in high school, and I knew if I didn't grab my stuff that night, it would be months before I had another chance. Looking back now, it sounds stupid, but at the time, it felt important enough to risk everything for. The city was almost dead because of Thanksgiving. Public transportation was a nightmare. By the time I got off the light rail and reached the bus stop near my coworker's apartment, it was already after 9 p.m. And that's when things started feeling wrong. Apple Maps kept lying to me. 1 minute away. Then the bus vanished. Refresh. 15 minutes away. Again and again. I stood there for over half an hour in the freezing cold, coughing so hard my chest burned. The bus stop was completely empty except for flickering overhead lights that buzzed like dying insects. Every few minutes, I'd lean forward, hoping to see headlights in the distance, but the road stayed dark. Then a black car slowly pulled into the station. Music thumped faintly from inside. Several men around their early 20s were laughing and speaking a language I didn't recognize. At first, I ignored them. I assumed they were just dropping someone off. But the car didn't leave immediately. It idled there, almost like they were watching me. Finally, one of the men stepped out. The car drove away, but not before slowing near the exit, like the driver was making sure his friend got out safely. The station was huge, and I intentionally stood far away from the actual bench because I was coughing nonstop and didn't want to bother anyone. But despite the entire empty station, the man walked directly toward me. My stomach tightened. He sat beside me without saying a word. I kept staring at my phone, pretending not to notice him. The arrival time changed again. No bus, no people, no sound except distant traffic and my own ragged coughing. Then, without warning, I felt a hand grip my shoulder. Not lightly, tightly. Before I could react, the man wrapped his arm around me and pulled me against him. For a second, my brain completely shut down. I remember staring at the glowing bus schedule sign while my heart hammered so hard I thought I would throw up. I could smell alcohol on his breath. His grip tightened every time I tried to move. Then he leaned close enough for me to hear him mumble something I couldn't fully understand. "You okay?" The question sounded wrong. Empty. Practiced. I whispered that I was fine, just waiting for the bus. He didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the dark road ahead of us, like he was waiting for something too. I kept trying to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Maybe he heard me coughing and thought I was sick. Maybe he saw me leaning into the street, looking for the bus, and assumed I needed help. Maybe he was just drunk. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, every instinct in my body was screaming that something was wrong. The problem was, I didn't know what to do. People always say, "Why didn't you run?" or "Why didn't you scream?" But fear doesn't work like that when you're trapped beside someone twice your size in the middle of an empty bus station at night. The man was easily over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing one of those bandana-style face coverings that hid most of his face. Back then, some people still wore masks because of COVID, so at first I tried not to think too much about it. Still, something about him felt off. The way he stared without blinking. The way he never looked at his phone. The way he kept glancing toward the dark road behind us instead of watching for the bus. It felt less like he was waiting for transportation and more like he was waiting for permission. A few minutes later, he stood up again. Before I could react, his arm wrapped around me for the second time. This time was worse. His hand slowly moved across my back in a strange, almost comforting motion that made my stomach twist. I froze completely. Thankfully, I was wearing a thick puffer jacket, but I could still feel the weight of his hand pressing through the fabric. Then, through the darkness, I finally saw headlights. The bus. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I stayed perfectly still until the bus pulled close enough to stop. Then I carefully slipped out of his grip and muttered, "My bus is here." He answered immediately. I couldn't fully understand what he said, but I understood enough. He was coming with me. Panic exploded in my chest. I knew I should have warned the driver, but I could barely speak without coughing violently, and my brain was running in circles trying to figure out if making a scene would only make things worse. What if he got angry? What if he had a weapon? What if the men in the car came back? So instead, I stepped onto the nearly empty bus and stayed standing on purpose. I knew someone his size would have to sit eventually. If I sat first, he'd sit directly beside me again. The entire ride felt unreal. The fluorescent lights inside the bus flickered every few seconds, making his face, covering and dark eyes, seem almost distorted whenever I glanced at him. I pretended to look at my phone while messaging a friend, trying to sound calm, even though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. That's when I started making a plan. I knew I couldn't lead him to my co-worker's apartment. There was no way I was risking him finding out where she lived. And I couldn't shake the horrifying feeling that the group of men who dropped him off earlier were somehow connected to whatever was happening. Then I realized something. The stop before my friend's apartment was near my job. I worked at a restaurant inside a large outdoor shopping center. Even though the stores closed at 9 p.m., it was around 9:30, which meant employees would still be inside finishing closing duties. More importantly, the entire area had cameras and overnight security patrols. It was the safest place I could think of. The only issue was the front entrance would already be locked. To get inside, I'd have to enter through the employee entrance in the back alley. And to reach that door, I need to cut through the outdoor trash enclosure first and quickly punch in the security code before he caught up to me. The entire bus ride, I kept imagining how it would happen. How fast could I run carrying a bowling ball? Would he grab me before I reached the keypad? Would anyone even hear me scream? When my stop finally arrived, my chest tightened so badly I thought I might pass out. The second I stepped off the bus, he got off right behind me. Then his hand clamped onto my shoulder again. Harder this time. I could barely move. His grip forced me into tiny, awkward steps as we walked through the freezing parking lot. The shopping center looked almost abandoned, with most of the lights already off and Christmas decorations swaying in the wind above empty walkways. I remember thinking how unbelievably quiet everything was. No cars, no voices, just my coughing and his footsteps beside me. As we got closer to the back employee entrance, I realized this was probably my only chance. Either I made it inside, or I didn't. Then something happened that probably saved me. The gate to the trash enclosure had been left propped open, and standing there, talking casually near the back door, were one of the chefs and another coworker. The moment I saw them, adrenaline took over. His grip loosened just slightly as we walked. I ripped myself free and sprinted. I nearly dropped my bowling ball as I shoved past the trash gate and ran toward the door. My lungs burned from coughing, and I could barely force the words out, but I remember yelling something like, "Close the door." He followed me. Thankfully, my coworker understood immediately. The heavy back door slammed shut behind me. And less than 2 seconds later, bang, the handle started rattling violently. Bang, bang, bang. The entire metal door shook as the man slammed against it from outside. Everyone froze. I could barely breathe as I tried explaining that I didn't know him, that he had followed me from the bus stop, that he kept grabbing me. Mall security was called immediately. While we waited, we watched him through the restaurant windows. He just paced back and forth outside in silence, almost impatiently. Then after a few minutes, he casually walked into the ice cream shop across from the restaurant like nothing had happened. That part still terrifies me the most. Not the grabbing, not the following, not even the pounding on the door. It was how calm he looked afterward, like he'd done this before. Security eventually arrived and asked me questions while one of my coworkers offered to drive me to my friend's apartment so I could still check on her cat. Afterward, she drove me home because I was too shaken to be alone. A few days later, my manager told me mall security wanted to know if I planned to press charges. I told him I wasn't sure. Mostly, I just wanted answers. I want to know who that man was and what explanation he gave security for following a sick college girl through an empty shopping center at night. But nobody ever followed up with me. I never learned his name, and I never found out what he actually wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about the way that car slowed down before leaving him at the station. Almost like I knew exactly what he was there to do. And honestly, I don't think I want to know the truth. By the time I reached the mountain road leading to Scott's house, I had already started regretting the trip. The snow was falling harder now, thick enough to blur the edges of the road, and there were long stretches where I didn't pass a single car for miles. The deeper I drove into the mountains, the more isolated everything became. Cell service kept cutting in and out. The trees crowded closer to the road like dark walls, and by the time the sun disappeared around 4 p.m., the entire mountain felt swallowed by darkness. I remember thinking how strange it was that Scott chose to live all the way out there alone. When I finally pulled into his driveway, my headlights revealed an old wooden house sitting crooked against the mountainside. It looked ancient, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. Only a few other houses were scattered nearby, all far apart and half hidden by trees and snow. The moment Scott stepped outside to greet me, something felt wrong. At first, I couldn't explain it. We hadn't seen each other in years, so naturally he looked older, but it was more than that. His movements were slower now, stiffer, almost delayed, like every action took a second too long to process. Even the way he spoke had changed. He'd start a sentence, then stop halfway through as if he forgot what he was talking about. Then he'd continue again like nothing happened. At one point, he just stood there staring at me in silence while snow collected on his shoulders. It was unsettling. Still, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Living alone in the mountains for years would probably make anyone socially awkward. Inside, the house was warm but strangely empty. There was barely any furniture. Just an old couch, a small wooden table, a couple mismatched chairs, and antique decorations hanging on the walls that looked like they belonged in a museum. The air smelled faintly like dust and firewood. Scott told me I could sleep on the pull-out couch downstairs. Right across from the couch was a long hallway leading deeper into the house. And for some reason, I hated looking at it. The hallway stretched into complete darkness with no light at the end. Both guest room doors stood open, black inside like empty mouths, and the bathroom sat at the very back where the shadows became too thick to see clearly. Scott explained that the rooms were empty because the house used to belong to his grandparents before they passed away recently. Now he lived there alone. Even after hearing that, something about the hallway still bothered me. It wasn't normal fear. It was the kind of instinctive discomfort that makes your body tense before your mind understands why. That first night, we sat around talking about old memories from middle school, but the entire conversation fell off balance. Scott barely made eye contact. Sometimes he would randomly drift silent mid-conversation and stare toward the hallway like he was listening for something. I tried joking about it once. "Dude, what keeps distracting you over there?" He blinked hard and immediately looked away. Nothing. But the way he answered made the hair on my arms stand up. Eventually, he said he was tired and headed upstairs to his bedroom. I unfolded the couch and got ready to sleep. Before turning off the lights, I intentionally left the lamp near the hallway on. I felt ridiculous doing it, but that hallway genuinely unnerved me. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly to a loud thump upstairs. At first I thought maybe Scott dropped something. Then the running started. Heavy footsteps pounded across the ceiling directly above me. Fast. Way too fast. It sounded like someone sprinting from one side of the upstairs room to the other, then abruptly stopping, then sprinting again. Back and forth. Back and forth. The floorboards shook hard enough for me to feel vibrations through the couch. I stared at the ceiling frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It didn't sound human. Not normal movement anyway. There was something frantic about it, like panic or rage. The footsteps continued for around 20 seconds before stopping instantly. No creaking afterward. No bedroom door opening. No footsteps down the stairs. Just silence. Complete silence. I waited for several minutes, barely breathing, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep, though I remember feeling deeply unsettled afterward. The second day only made things stranger. Scott barely talked at all. He wandered around the house distracted, barely touching his food, barely responding when I asked if he was okay. Sometimes he'd nod without even looking at me. At first I thought maybe he regretted inviting me, but then I noticed something else. He kept walking down that hallway, over and over, at least 5 or 6 times throughout the day. Every time, he disappeared into the darkness for a minute or two before quietly returning. I assumed he was using the bathroom at the end of the hall, but the weird thing was, I never once heard the toilet flush. By nighttime, a snowstorm rolled over the mountain. Wind slammed against the walls hard enough to make the windows rattle. Honestly, under normal circumstances, it would have been cozy. I've always loved the feeling of being snowed in somewhere warm while a storm rages outside. But that house no longer felt warm. It felt sealed shut, like the storm had trapped me there. I stayed awake scrolling on my phone for over an hour before finally trying to sleep. Then around 2 a.m. again, I woke up. This time, the sound was quieter. A slow scraping noise echoed somewhere down the hallway. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. It sounded like something heavy dragging across the wooden floor. I held perfectly still, listening. Then the noise stopped completely. For a second, I thought maybe I imagined it. Then, top! A sharp little knock hit the wall directly behind my head. Not loud. Just deliberate, like someone flicking the wall with their finger. Every muscle in my body locked up. I slowly turned my head toward the hallway. That night, I had forgotten to leave the hallway light on. The entire corridor was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but I had the horrible feeling that something inside the darkness was looking back at me. I refused to get up. I just rolled onto my other side and kept repeating the same thing in my head. Old house, old pipes, old wood, but deep down, I knew that wasn't what I heard. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. By the third night, the entire atmosphere in the house felt unbearable. I kept catching Scott staring at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Not casually either. Long, silent stares that stopped the second I looked back at him, like he was checking whether I had noticed something. Or someone. I seriously considered leaving early, but the snowstorm had gotten worse and the roads were supposed to be dangerous until morning. So I stayed. After dinner, Scott went upstairs unusually early without even saying goodnight. I sat alone on the couch, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, wondering why I had even come there in the first place. Eventually, exhausted, I shut my eyes. And once again, at exactly around 2 a.m., I woke up. At exactly 2 a.m., my eyes snapped open. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized I couldn't move. Not my arms, not my legs, not even my fingers. Panic flooded through me instantly. I had heard stories about sleep paralysis before, but experiencing it was something completely different. It felt like my mind had woken up while the rest of my body stayed dead. I couldn't even feel myself breathing properly. The only thing I could move were my eyes. And then I saw movement in the hallway. At first, I thought my brain was creating shapes out of darkness. But after a few seconds, I realized someone was actually standing there. Scott. He was standing at the very end of the hallway, perfectly motionless. The darkness swallowed his face completely, turning him into nothing but a tall, black silhouette. His arms hung stiffly at his sides, and he wasn't moving at all, not shifting his weight, not blinking, nothing, just watching me. The sight of him standing there in complete silence triggered a level of fear I can't properly describe. It felt wrong in a way that bypassed logic completely. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was deeply, deeply wrong. I tried to speak. Nothing came out. I tried forcing my body to move, even just enough to twitch a finger, but I remained frozen on the couch, staring helplessly into the darkness. Scott didn't move for what felt like forever. 10 seconds, 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Then slowly, very slowly, He turned his head toward the guest room at the end of the hall and walked into it. No footsteps, no creaking floorboards, just silent movement disappearing into the darkness. The second he vanished, control slowly returned to my body. First my fingers twitched, then my arms. Then finally I sucked in a deep breath and jolted upright, drenched in sweat. I immediately started trying to rationalize it. Sleep paralysis can cause hallucinations. People see shadow figures all the time. That's what this was. It had to be. But deep down, something felt horribly wrong. Because whatever I saw didn't feel dreamlike. It felt real. I sat there listening carefully. The house was silent. No footsteps upstairs. No bathroom noises. Nothing. Finally, I whispered, "Scott." No answer. Every part of me wanted to stay on that couch until sunrise. Instead, against my better judgment, I stood up and slowly walked toward the hallway. The darkness inside it felt heavier than before somehow. The cold wooden floor creaked softly under my feet as I moved closer to the guest room where I had seen him disappear. I reached the doorway and looked inside. At first, the room appeared empty. Then I noticed someone standing in the far corner near the window. My entire body locked up again. It was a person, completely still, facing the window. I couldn't see their face, only the outline of their body, standing motionless against the faint moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. For one horrifying second, I thought maybe it was Scott, but something about the shape looked wrong. Too tall, too stiff, almost unnatural. The room was silent except for the sound of wind scraping branches against the outside of the house. I slowly backed away from the doorway, terrified the figure would suddenly turn toward me. It didn't move. The second I cleared the hallway, I spun around and practically ran upstairs. Scott's bedroom door was cracked open. Inside, he was asleep in bed, completely asleep. I froze in the doorway, staring at him. There was no way. I rushed over and shook him awake hard enough to startle him. He opened his eyes, looking genuinely confused and irritated. "What?" he muttered. I started rambling immediately, trying to explain what I saw downstairs, telling him someone was inside the house. But the weirdest part wasn't his reaction. It was what he didn't do. He never once looked toward the hallway outside his bedroom. Not once. Most people would panic, ask questions, grab a weapon, check downstairs. Scott just sat there silently listening to me. And slowly, his expression changed. Not confusion, not disbelief, recognition, like he already knew exactly what I had seen. That realization scared me more than the figure downstairs. I finally asked him directly, "Scott, who is downstairs?" For a few seconds, he just stared at me. Then he shrugged. That was it. No explanation, no concern, just a shrug. Something inside me broke at that moment. I didn't care if there was a blizzard outside. I didn't care if the roads were dangerous. I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to leave that house immediately. I ran downstairs and started shoving my things into my bag as fast as possible. The entire time, I kept glancing toward the hallway, expecting to see that figure standing there again. Every shadow looked alive. Every creak of the house made my heart jump. I've never packed faster in my life. The moment I stepped outside, the freezing mountain air actually felt relieving compared to being inside that house. Snow blasted sideways through the driveway as I wiped my car off in a panic and threw my bag into the passenger seat. I just wanted to get away. But before leaving, I made one mistake. I looked back at the house, and there, in the window of the guest room at the end of the hallway, was a silhouette, standing perfectly still behind the glass, watching me. I never saw movement, never saw a face, just that dark human shape staring out from the room where I had seen someone standing only minutes earlier. I backed out of the driveway so fast I nearly slid into a snowbank. That was the last time I ever saw Scott's house. After that weekend, he slowly stopped responding to my texts. At first, I thought maybe he was embarrassed or angry that I left suddenly. But eventually, weeks passed without hearing anything from him. I genuinely started worrying that something had happened to him. Finally, I texted him saying I was considering calling for a wellness check. Hours later, he responded with only 2 words. "I'm fine." That was it. No explanation. No apology. Nothing else. And after that, he never answered another message again. The person I stayed with in that mountain house was not the Scott I grew up with. I don't know what happened to him. And honestly, I don't know if I want to know. But sometimes late at night, I still think about that silhouette standing silently in the hallway at exactly 2 a.m. And the part that terrifies me the most is the feeling that Scott wasn't scared of it anymore.